One word, carved into a post 3 years after they vanished. Croatoan. It's the only clue left behind by 115 souls, men, women, and children, who simply ceased to exist in the historical record. For centuries, we've treated the lost colony of Roanoke as a ghost story, a horrifying warning of colonial failure. But what if that single word wasn't a tombstone, but a direction?
The prevailing narrative is one of inevitable tragedy, massacre, or famine. But the geography of the message suggests cooperation, not destruction. They told Governor White exactly where to find them.
Listen closely. By the end of this documentary, we will present the most compelling physical evidence yet, archaeological fragments dug from the sand, that suggests the lost colony didn't perish. They integrated. If you want the full, terrifying truth behind history's greatest vanishing act, make sure you're subscribed right now.
If Croatoan wasn't a death knell, then it was a navigational beacon. But beacons need a map. And for centuries, the only map we had was the one John White drew before he left. A map that shows the colony, and then nothing further inland that was significant. It's almost too clean.
That's the critical juncture, Sharon. White's map, the one we've all studied in history books, it explicitly shows the word Croatoan carved on the post near the inlet. But look closer at the original archival drafts, the ones kept locked away in the British Library. They tell a different story about what he didn't document publicly.
Different how? We're talking about the man who was supposed to be their savior. Why would he deliberately mislead future search parties?
Mislead or protect? Early drafts, specifically those studied by the 1990s research teams, show faint markings just southeast of the intended Croatoan Island location. Almost invisible pencil work, suggesting triangulation.
Triangulation? That implies a deliberate attempt to code the location, moving beyond a simple island name. So we have the map and the key, the word Croatoan. But we still don't know who sent the message or why they needed to encode it so deeply. And that leads us to the terrifying part.
Exactly. If White was documenting a fallback position, he wouldn't use the public name. He'd use something obscure. And this is where things get genuinely unsettling. Researchers overlaid the known colonial survey points onto White's primary map, then ran a spectral analysis on the ink density of that faint pencil work.
Wait a minute. Spectral analysis? That's deep forensics. What did it reveal?
It revealed 2 points that converged, forming a precise coordinate structure that did not correspond to the known Croatoan village location. It pointed inland, deep inland, almost directly toward the Appalachian foothills.
Inland? But the prevailing theories, disease, starvation, assimilation into the local Croatoan tribe, all hinge on them staying near the coast, near supply lines. Moving that far inland suggests something far more organized than desperate refugees.
It suggests preparation, and that preparation was codified using a system that John White, an Elizabethan courtier and cartographer, should not have known. We are talking about a form of coordinate geometry that wasn't standardized or publicly adopted by European navigators until nearly 50 years after the colonists vanished.
So you're saying the clue wasn't just written by a survivor. It was written using a system that hadn't been invented yet. That's impossible.
Or it implies 2 things. Either John White was a time-traveling prodigy who invented advanced navigation decades early, or the Croatoan people weren't just a neighboring tribe they assimilated with. They were teaching the colonists something profoundly different about the land.
Let's pause on that. If they weren't assimilated, if they were taught a new system, what were they running from that required an inland escape route calculated with advanced geometry? Were they hiding from the Spanish? Or were they hiding from something that had already arrived on the coast? The geographical location this analysis spits out, that secret coordinate, it places them squarely in the Great Dismal Swamp region, a place historically known for being impenetrable, a true labyrinth. Why choose that hellish landscape over the relatively known terrain of the coast?
Because the swamp offers ultimate concealment. But the coordinates don't stop at the edge of the swamp. They point through it, toward a nexus point. A place that, according to every known Native American oral tradition in that region, was avoided. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was already occupied.
Occupied by whom?
The historical record stops dead at the coast. We have indigenous testimonies centuries later mentioning strange lights and structures in the interior, but nothing concrete connecting it to 1587. This is where the academic world hits a brick wall. But we didn't come here for walls. We came for cracks. Think about this for a moment. 115 people vanish. The only clue is a single word pointing toward a known native settlement. But forensic mapping of the original survey documents suggests they didn't go to the settlement. They used the word as a decoy, a breadcrumb, while actually moving towards a precisely calculated hidden inland fortress, using knowledge of trigonometry that shouldn't exist in 1590.
It suggests a secret society, Sharon. A split. Some stayed, assimilated. That's the simple story. Others were ushered out by an organized faction, perhaps led by White himself, carrying specific intelligence. But intelligence about what? And who provided the tools for this escape? What if the Croatoan people weren't just offering refuge, but were the keepers of an ancient terrestrial secret?
If they had this coordinate, if they had this advanced path, it means they were expecting hostile interference from the sea. They prepared for an evacuation scenario where the coast was compromised. But the historical narrative suggests the English crown was their only major concern. So, what threat necessitated a covert, geometrically precise march into the deepest, most hostile territory of the continent?
That's the question that keeps me up at night. Because when we follow that inland trajectory, that precise hidden coordinate, it doesn't just lead to the swamp. It leads directly to the highest elevated point within the Dismal Swamp watershed. And when we cross-reference that elevation point with geological surveys from the 1950s, we found something the original surveyors missed.
Tell me.
They found non-native metal signatures, not Spanish, much older, and not natural deposits, something smelted, something shaped. It looked like infrastructure, buried deep, a settlement that wasn't built by the colonists, but perhaps built for them, or perhaps built before them.
So the code wasn't just an escape route for the lost colony. It was an invitation to a location that was already waiting, a pre-existing sanctuary. But if that sanctuary was already there, then the colonists weren't just pioneers seeking a new life. They were reinforcements, or perhaps refugees joining a much older fight. Chapter 3 will reveal exactly what the geological surveys pulled from that hidden coordinate and why the US government spent decades trying to bury that initial discovery. That's right. The map we saw publicly was a sanitized version. The real one, the draft White kept locked away, it holds an anomaly that changes everything we think we know about the destination.
It's almost as if White was documenting two realities simultaneously. On the public map, Roanoke surroundings are clearly delineated, but on the private sketch, there's an area inland, southwest of Croatoan Island, marked by strange, highly stylized bird iconography. No topographical features, just these symbols.
Bird iconography. Think about that. Not a settlement marker, not a river. Birds. And these symbols, they only appear when the draft is subjected to specific, high-frequency ultraviolet light. What we're dealing with here isn't just an omission, it's invisible ink politics.
Invisible ink implies a third party who didn't want the English crown, or perhaps even the Spanish, to know the true location. If Croatoan was a breadcrumb, this hidden section of the map is the whole loaf. It points toward the inner coastal plain, deep into what is now Hyde County, far from the known Croatoan territory.
And what was at that location in 1590? Nothing indigenous documentation suggests a major dwelling, but something else was there, according to later, highly suppressed geological surveys from the 1920s. Something artificial.
Wait, you're linking 16th century colonial distress signals to 20th century government surveys of the landscape? That's a massive temporal leap, Sharon.
The evidence dictates the leap, Doctor. We're chasing a secret that spans centuries. The symbols on White's map, the birds, they match etchings found on bedrock samples removed during exploratory canal digging near the Alligator River Delta. These weren't Native American markings. They were too angular, too precise. They looked manufactured.
Manufactured? You're suggesting the Croatoan destination wasn't a place of refuge, but a pre-existing structure they were sent to? A rendezvous point?
Precisely. The colonists didn't wander off to live among friendly tribes. They followed a literal map marker to a specific geometric coordinate. The mystery shifts from where did they go to who carved the map and for whom. Listen closely. If John White was the cartographer who documented the disappearance, who was the cartographer who created the hidden map that he felt compelled to hide in plain sight?
If it wasn't White, then someone else had access to the location marker before the colony was established. Someone with advanced surveying skills, capable of creating markings that survive centuries underground.
The answer lies in the person who managed the Roanoke expedition's supply chain, the expedition's true patron, not Queen Elizabeth I. We look at the names associated with Sir Walter Raleigh's funding structure, and one stands out as having deep, almost obsessive interests in non-European geodesy and esoteric geometry. That man was Dr. John Dee.
Dee? Raleigh's occult advisor, the man who communicated with angels through scrying mirrors?
The very same. Dee wasn't just dabbling in alchemy, he was attempting to map unseen realities, believing certain geographical intersections held unique energetic signatures. He had the motive, the pursuit of knowledge beyond the known world, and the means to encode it onto a navigational chart. So, we have the map, hidden by White, pointing to a specific location in the North Carolina interior. We have the suspected sender of the true coordinates, John Dee. But this brings us to the core problem, the one that makes historians lose sleep. If Dee was guiding them using esoteric knowledge, why did he only give the colonists one word to find their way back, Croatoan? Why risk everything on a single ambiguous landmark?
It suggests urgency, a rapid deployment perhaps, or maybe the word wasn't for them.
Exactly. Croatoan wasn't a signpost for Eleanor Dare and her daughter. It was a distress signal, deliberately left behind in case the prearranged contact failed. A public breadcrumb to throw off the Spanish, while the real destination was only readable by those who knew how to look, White and presumably the colonists themselves. This is the inflection point. We have the direction, we have the architect of the hidden path, but we still don't know who was supposed to find that signal, and who was waiting for them at the end of Dee's invisible ink trail. Because if John Dee was directing the colonists using esoteric geometry, then the place they went wasn't just a clearing in the woods, it was a nexus point. And when we cross-reference the 1590 hidden coordinates with seismic data from the 1980s, what we find underneath that swampy ground defies any logical explanation for a 16th century settlement. Are we looking for the lost colony, or are we looking for what the lost colony found?
So, we have the map, and we have the key. The invisible ink pointing us southwest of Croatoan Island, marked not with a place name, but with these bizarre, almost ceremonial bird icons.
And that's the sticking point, Sharon. Why birds? If John White was communicating something vital about a relocation, you'd expect landmarks, a river fork, a mountain range. Why use what appears to be religious or spiritual iconography?
Exactly. Because, expert, the assumption we've all made that the colonists simply moved to the nearest friendly tribe, the Croatoan people, that assumption just collapsed. If they were going to the Croatoan village, White wouldn't need invisible ink pointing somewhere else entirely.
So the word Croatoan wasn't the destination, it was the translator.
Precisely. It's the bridge, the native language key needed to decipher what those birds mean. We had to stop treating the colonists as purely English subjects. We had to look at them through the lens of the people they were interacting with during those 3 formative years. We commissioned a linguistic analysis, not just of Algonquian dialects common to the Carolina coast, but specifically focusing on symbols that might have been traded, bartered, or adopted by the early English settlers who lived with the Croatoan people before the final departure.
And what did the linguists turn up regarding these avian mugivs? Were they related to the local bird species? An eagle for strength?
No, it's far more specific. The stylized iconography, the wide wingspan, the sharp, almost geometric head, matches glyphs found in oral tradition stories from the Lumbee culture, a group historically linked closely with the Croatoan people.
The Lumbee? I thought they were further inland already.
They were establishing deeper ties, and in those specific Lumbee narratives, that particular bird glyph doesn't represent a bird at all. It represents a sky watcher, or more alarmingly, the Great Transformer. Listen closely. This isn't a location. This is a condition. The symbol means where the old ways are transformed by the sight of the sky. This is not where they settled. This is where they changed.
Transformed? Charon, are we suggesting religious conversion or assimilation into a completely different societal structure? The colonists were not known for peacefully joining indigenous cultures.
They had 3 years, expert. 3 years of desperation, starvation, and reliance on a culture White barely documented. They were given a choice: die as English settlers or survive as something else. And White's private map is showing us the coordinates for this something else.
We cross-referenced the geographical data from the private map, the angles derived from the faint triangulation points visible only under the UV spectrum, and the resulting location places the target zone approximately 40 miles inland near the confluence of two minor tributaries that feed the Cape Fear River.
40 miles inland from the coast? That's a massive undertaking for 115 people in 1590. That area was considered hostile territory by the other coastal tribes.
Hostile to whom? Hostile to the English attempting to impose dominion, or hostile to the people who chose integration? Think about the resources needed for that trek. They didn't just walk there, they were guided. So we have the map and the key. Croatoan translates the invisible bird symbol, which points inland to a place designated as the Great Transformer. This strongly suggests the colony was not destroyed, but was actively relocating to form a new hybrid community, sanctioned or perhaps even engineered by indigenous allies.
That's one interpretation. But if they survived, why the silence? Why wouldn't they send a message back to England, especially when White returned? Why let history believe they vanished into the ether?
That's the million-pound question, isn't it? Why the self-erasure? And that leads us to the terrifying part. Because if they didn't just move to a friendly village, and if they chose transformation, we have to ask, what were they transforming from? We know they were starving. We know they were desperate. But the evidence suggests something far more calculated than a simple move for food security. What if the real threat wasn't the environment or rival tribes? What if the threat was the returning English fleet itself?
Wait, you think they actively chose to disappear from the English?
If you knew the second wave of English colonists, the soldiers, the governors, the tax collectors, were coming to subjugate you, would you stay on the coast, waiting to be enslaved or reconverted to a failing power structure? Or would you embrace the guidance of the people who had shown you true survival, even if it meant abandoning your name? The silence wasn't an accident of history expert. It was a declaration of independence, etched in invisible ink and coded in a language only their protectors understood. But surviving inland means defending that new life. And if the colonists chose survival over sovereignty, they must have acquired something very valuable, something that warranted such extreme measures to protect it from Raleigh's next mission. What did the 115 souls of Roanoke take with them on that inland journey that was worth completely vanishing from the world stage? And when the British eventually found this new community decades later, what did they find they were really fighting to suppress?
Why birds? It's the question hanging in the humid air of 1590. If John White, under duress or allegiance, was leaving a breadcrumb trail, using avian symbolism, especially in the context of the Taino people native to that area, isn't a random flourish. It's a direct line to their cosmology.
Exactly. We've spent so long focusing on the European search parties, Raleigh, White himself, that we overlook the context of the land they were trying to escape to. The Taino, or related Siouan groups in that region, had complex spiritual systems. Birds, particularly predatory ones or those associated with the sky, often represented messengers between worlds.
Messengers between worlds. So the icon isn't saying, go to the place where the birds fly. It's saying, go to the place identified by the spirit messenger, the celestial guide. This pivots the entire narrative from a failed English colony seeking refuge to a group attempting cultural assimilation or protection under an indigenous authority.
I cross-referenced those specific stylized avian markings with known Taino effigies and iconography recovered from archaeological digs in the Carolinas, not just Roanoke, but further inland along river systems indicated by the vague topography on White's original drafts. One specific symbol keeps aligning, the representation of the hurricane, or the great storm spirit, often depicted with vast wings. It's a symbol of transformative power, not simple geography.
Transformative power. This isn't a plea for rescue, it's a declaration of a new allegiance. Listen closely to the implications here. The colonists didn't just run away, they followed a predetermined path dictated by indigenous spiritual guidance, a path White felt compelled to record privately, knowing the English crown couldn't understand or might actively suppress that information.
It changes the motivation. If the goal was assimilation, they needed a destination that offered security from the Europeans, a location already understood and protected by the powerful local nations. We need to stop thinking of the colonists as victims lost in the wilderness and start viewing them as collaborators seeking sanctuary.
Collaborators who used a secret map. So, we have the map and we have the key, the invisible ink pointing us southwest of Croatoan Island, marked by the avian cipher. But we still don't know who exactly sent the message or why White would risk treason by documenting it.
That leads us to the terrifying part, the next layer of erasure. When we analyze the chemical signature of the invisible ink used by John White on that private sketch, it's not standard iron gall or common acid etchings of the period. The forensic reports we obtained show traces of manganese dioxide and crust cochineal dye mixed with a binding agent that dates to the late 16th century, yes, but utilized preservation techniques historically associated only with high-ranking Mesoamerican scribes centuries earlier.
Wait, are you suggesting the ink itself wasn't White's proprietary code, but a pre-existing documented system being fed to him?
I'm suggesting White was merely the transcriber, Charon, the messenger. The message, the method of hiding the message, predates his involvement. This wasn't an English secret, it was a secret being shared through an Englishman.
That's an astronomical leap. That implies a deep, established connection between the Roanoke survivors and a much wider, possibly sophisticated indigenous network that was actively communicating with the English long before 1590, a network capable of creating documents hidden in plain sight using ancient methods.
Precisely. And if that connection was so deep, why did the official records state the colonists simply vanished? Why the silence? Why was John White allowed to return to England and live out his life, seemingly haunted but never truly prosecuted for losing the colony, if he was actively collaborating with an independent network? Because the silence wasn't about a failure to rescue, it was about a successful quarantine. The English crown knew where they went, but they knew that location was protected by a power structure they couldn't breach without risking total war.
So the official narrative, the lost colony myth, was a deliberate smokescreen maintained by the crown to prevent further expeditions from stumbling onto whatever they found inland?
A smokescreen supported by the very map that pointed the way. The final piece of the puzzle involves the timing. The moment White carved Croatoan publicly, the settlement on Roanoke Island was abandoned, but the bird symbol points southwest. What happens southwest of Croatoan Island in the late 16th century that would necessitate 115 people disappearing overnight, following an indigenous spiritual guidance and being actively hidden by the crown? It wasn't a settlement they were looking for, Charon. It was a sovereign entity. And in Chapter 6, we uncover the single surviving letter, smuggled out of the region decades later, that names the civilization they joined. A civilization history claims was already extinct. Prepare yourselves, because the lost colony of Roanoke didn't vanish. They defected.
So, the Taino cosmology, the bird messenger, it gives us the language of the message, but we're still missing the critical piece. Who among the colonists understood this language well enough to translate John White's cryptic ink? We have the map, we have the key, but we still don't know who sent it or where exactly they went after the birds pointed the way.
Exactly. And that's where we have to consider the survivors themselves. We've treated the 115 lost as a monolithic group, English settlers, but we often forget the crucial, often overlooked component of the Roanoke settlement, the French Huguenot refugees, the individuals who married into the local Algonquian tribes for survival before White even left. They weren't just English idealists.
You're pointing to the linguistic bridge, the people who already had established, perhaps strained, relationships with the surrounding native populations long before the word Croatoan was carved.
Precisely. Think about Eleanor Dare's daughter, Virginia Dare, born there. She wasn't just English. The children growing up on Roanoke Island were bilingual, perhaps even trilingual, absorbing local knowledge. If White needed to send a coded message that referenced local spirituality, the birds, he wouldn't use the language of the London court. He'd use the language of those who lived there.
This implies assimilation, or at least deep integration, was the plan, not the failure. The bird code wasn't a distress signal for rescuers to find them in the woods. It was a prearranged signal to guide them to a specific, known cultural nexus. But where does this lead us geographically, using the map data?
We established the southwest vector from Croatoan Island. When you overlay historical Taino settlement patterns, specifically those who resisted Spanish subjugation further south, but had trade routes extending north, that trajectory points inland, deep into the territory historically claimed by the Tuscarora Confederacy, but bordering Lumbee ancestral lands in what is now eastern North Carolina. These are dense, complex inland territories.
Inland, away from the familiar coastline, a move towards consolidation rather than dispersal. That flies in the face of every theory suggesting Spanish attack or starvation near the water.
It does. And here's the element that genuinely unnerved me when I cross-referenced White's expedition logs with later coastal reconnaissance reports from the 1650s. There are recurring mentions, scattered almost as footnotes, of unusual metalwork, and distinctly non-local agricultural practices observed far upriver, centuries before verifiable English settlement attempts in that region.
Metalwork? The Roanoke settlers brought very little heavy iron. They weren't capable of sophisticated metallurgy. Are we talking about Spanish artifacts being repurposed or something else entirely?
That's the terrifying part. The descriptions are vague but consistent. Tools that seem disproportionately robust for the known native groups in the immediate area, suggesting either a highly structured community or one that retained crucial European knowledge.
So the theory shifts from the lost colony was killed to the lost colony reconstituted itself, perhaps as a hybrid society deep in the interior, protected by a secret covenant referenced by avian symbols.
That's the implication. But covenants require maintenance. They require identity preservation. And that leads us to the single most compelling and controversial piece of forensic evidence recovered from the area White's map indicated.
Controversial how? We're beyond standard archaeology now. What did they find that speaks directly to a surviving English lineage hundreds of miles inland?
DNA tracing, not of bones, Charon, of artifacts recovered from stratified layers deep within a suspected Tuscarora ceremonial mound complex, an area that archaeological surveys had always marked as purely indigenous pre-contact or early contact, never late 16th century English.
Artifacts, small, personal items, perhaps buried with the dead of the successor group? And you're saying the mitochondrial DNA traces point back to the initial 115?
We found traces of specific genetic markers, markers unique to the known passenger list of the 1587 fleet, embedded in the lacquer of what appears to be a heavily modified navigational quadrant dating to approximately 1610. It suggests that the knowledge and perhaps even a key navigational tool belonging to the original colonists survived with the community that moved inland.
Wait, a quadrant dating to 1610 found generations later in an indigenous site carrying the DNA signature of the 1587 settlers? That is staggering. That is evidence of survival and transmission of culture, not disappearance.
It is. The quadrant itself is heavily weathered, clearly adapted for local use, perhaps even decorated with local motifs alongside the European calibration marks. It wasn't lost, it was inherited. But this only deepens the mystery, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. If they survived and if they maintained tools and identity, why the absolute silence? Why let the narrative of the lost colony persist for over 4 centuries? What forced them to choose complete historical blackout over rejoining the English effort? We have the direction, we have the potential linguistic key, we have genetic echoes of survival decades after the official record ends, but we are still missing the motive for such a profound and generational disappearance. And that motive, I believe, is written in the next set of artifacts we uncovered. Items that suggest a direct, hostile interaction with the Spanish presence in the region long before any other English colony made significant headway south of Chesapeake Bay. If they were hiding from the Spanish or actively fighting them using indigenous alliances, then Croatoan wasn't just a destination marker, it was a strategic military outpost. Join us in Chapter 7 as we examine the Spanish reaction to this inland ghost colony and the archaeological site that proves Roanoke didn't vanish, it went to war.
They weren't just English idealists, Charon. They were survivors attempting cultural integration long before the official relocation, and that is the critical difference.
Integration implies language acquisition. If the bird iconography, the Taino or Algonquian sky messenger symbol, was the key to John White's invisible ink, then the colonists needed a bridge, a translator who understood both the colonists' need for secrecy and the local spiritual language.
Precisely. We need to stop looking for a single group, the English lost. We need to look for the hybrid survivors, the Huguenots, the French Protestant refugees who settled among the local communities for protection against the Spanish, and perhaps later, the pressures of the English crown. They had established relationships.
But John White barely mentions the Huguenots in his public correspondence leading up to his departure. It's almost as if they were an inconvenient footnote to Raleigh's grand narrative.
Inconvenient, or too deeply embedded to easily separate from the narrative he was forced to present to the Queen. This isn't just about survival now. It's about espionage masquerading as settlement. Think about the logistics. If 115 people move inland, guided by a Taino symbol, they aren't setting up a new Virginia outpost. They are seeking refuge within an established network.
A network that would communicate using their own established means. The bird glyph isn't just a marker. It's a password for those already initiated into the local power structure. The Huguenots seeking sanctuary would have been the perfect intermediaries.
So, we need proof that these Huguenot families maintained a record, a ledger that survived the Exodus, something that chronicles who went and why they chose that specific cryptic destination.
And this is where the primary source material gets truly explosive. There's an obscure record, a shipment ledger from a later failed attempt to resettle the area in the early 1600s, a ledger dismissed by most historians as irrelevant colonial inventory data. But tucked within its inventory, Charon, is an anomaly.
Go on. Don't bury the lead.
It lists supplies requisitioned not for a new colony, but for an established community further inland, described vaguely as the settlement of the Feathered Covenant. And the inventory includes specific high-quality French linen and obscure metallurgical tools, tools inconsistent with standard English colonial needs at the time.
The Feathered Covenant, the birds. This ledger isn't describing a failed resupply mission, it's describing contact with the very people we hypothesize survived, the assimilated group.
Worse, the linen is listed as being traded for, not purchased, traded for local materials. This suggests a functioning, self-sufficient community already existed when this later expedition attempted contact, receiving goods, not establishing new supply lines.
So, we have the map, we have the key, the bird symbol pointing southwest, and now we have the potential recipient, a hybrid, French-aligned community deep inland. But the absolute clincher, the evidence that seals the fate of those 115 souls, lies in who signed off on those trade requisitions from the English side, who confirmed the receipt of goods sent to the Feathered Covenant, knowing full well the colonists were supposed to be lost, who had the authority and the hidden knowledge to track them for decades.
The signature on that ledger, Charon, belongs to a man who historians believe died of fever in Jamestown years before that ledger was even written, a man officially listed as a casualty of the early Virginia Company attempts.
Wait, you're saying a leading English official, presumed dead, was secretly coordinating with the lost colonists decades later, using the language of the Taino and the Huguenot integration?
I'm saying that the person monitoring the fate of Roanoke wasn't trying to find them. He was managing their continued isolation. The Croatoan Code wasn't just a message of relocation, it was a ticket to a new reality managed by people we thought were gone or powerless.
The scope of this changes everything. It implies a coordinated, multi-generational conspiracy stretching across oceans, utilizing linguistic and religious subterfuge to essentially erase 115 people from official history. Think about that, viewers. This isn't just about where they went, it's about why they were intentionally buried in the historical record. We have traced the breadcrumbs from the carved word to the invisible ink, from the bird symbol to the Huguenot linguistic bridge. But the puppet master remains in the shadows. The supposed dead man signing off on contact with a secret inland settlement, that implies the lost colony never vanished. They were simply reclassified. They became assets. And if they were assets, what was their purpose in this new hidden society? And what happened when the English establishment realized their secret was compromised?
If that official was maintaining contact, he wasn't protecting them, he was controlling them. And when control fails, Charon, the cleanup is often permanent.
And that leads us to the terrifying part. Chapter 8 isn't about where they went. It's about what they found when they got there, and the violent, systematic effort required to ensure that evidence and those 115 souls remained permanently erased from our history.
That translator, the one who bridges the gap between John White's desperate cipher and the local indigenous knowledge, that person isn't just a footnote. They are the key. We're looking for someone who spoke the King's English, who understood the Latin of the settlement charters, but who also walked the paths of the local tribes. We fixated on the English leadership, but what if the translator was someone White trusted implicitly? Someone responsible for the colony's records?
You're talking about the clerk, the factor, the man keeping the ledger. But why would the accountant hold the secret to relocation? Surely that falls to the governor, or perhaps the military advisor.
Because the logistics of vanishing require meticulous documentation, not just bravery. Moving 115 people inland discreetly while maintaining some semblance of order, that's an accounting nightmare. And this is where the second archival anomaly surfaces, hidden not in cartography, but in census records. We found it referenced in marginalia notes from a subsequent failed relief effort years later.
Marginalia? Meaning someone was scribbling notes in the margins of an official document about the Roanoke venture?
Precisely. A reference to Ananias Dare's deficit ledger. Ananias Dare, the father of Virginia Dare.
Historically, he was listed as a cooper, a barrel maker, essential but not a primary administrator.
Wait, a deficit ledger? That suggests financial mismanagement, not covert operation planning. Are we shifting from spiritual codes to embezzlement?
Hold that thought. If Dare was simply making barrels, why would his personal ledger be referenced years later as a critical point of missing information? We cross-referenced Dare's known movements with the Huguenot arrivals. It appears Dare wasn't just making barrels for storing salted fish. His primary role, hidden beneath the veneer of his trade, was managing the private stores, the barter inventory, the goods traded directly with the local tribes for supplies and, crucially, intelligence. This is the pivot point. The ledger wasn't about barrels of ale, it was a record of cultural exchange formalized as trade. Think of it, the Huguenots needed to integrate quickly. Ananias Dare, the quiet cooper, was likely the only one systematically logging every exchange. A metal pot for a specific story, a length of rope for detailed coastal knowledge, and more importantly, tracking who within the colony was leaning too heavily into the local dialects and customs.
So Dare wasn't the translator, he was the accountant keeping tabs on the assimilated ones, a loyalty tracker disguised as inventory control? That is chillingly effective espionage.
Exactly. The deficit mentioned in the historical note, it wasn't money missing. It was the absence of documented trade with certain key individuals after a specific date in 1589, the date John White left for England, the date the invisible ink map was likely finalized. What if Dare, realizing the English crown was going to abandon the colony, used his ledger not to track deficits, but to document the success of the integration? He documented who had successfully gone silent, who had effectively disappeared into the local structure. He was auditing their Vanishing Act.
That implies the relocation was decided upon and executed before White sailed back to England. The carving of Croatoan wasn't a message left for the rescue party. It was a final, desperate signpost for the few who might be looking in the wrong direction, a misdirection for the crown.
That is the terrifying implication. If the colony packed up and left before White departed, then the message wasn't, "We are here." It was, "We are gone, and you will never find us if you look on the coast." The Croatoan carving was a smokescreen to buy them time to move inland, following the bird path. But if Dare documented their assimilation, where is that ledger now? We have references to its existence, the stain of its absence in subsequent reports. But the physical artifact, the true accounting of who left and where they went, is missing.
If the goal was to disappear from history, destroying or hiding the ledger detailing the logistics of that disappearance would be paramount. It would be the ultimate proof of pre-planned, unauthorized relocation, a betrayal of Raleigh's entire colonial enterprise.
Exactly. So we have the map indicating the direction, the bird symbols leading southwest, and we have the method, the cultural assimilation facilitated by the Huguenots, and now we have the witness, Dare's ledger. But the ledger itself is the black hole in this investigation. Why would someone risk everything to keep that accounting secret, unless the secret itself was more valuable than their lives? Listen closely. If the colonists successfully integrated following the Taino path indicated by the map, they didn't just vanish into the woods. They merged with a civilization that was already facing its own existential threat from European diseases and encroachment. So the real question isn't, where did the 115 go? But rather, what happened when 115 English Christians encountered a population already fighting for its life? Because that ledger, the final accounting by Ananias Dare, points us towards the most dangerous possibility of all. It suggests they didn't just relocate to survive, they relocated to fight back, armed with knowledge they had bartered for. And if that's true, then the lost colony never vanished. It simply changed uniforms. And Chapter 9 begins where we find the only other physical trace linked to Dare's missing records, a small, seemingly insignificant artifact found miles from the coast, buried deep in Cherokee territory.